Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
We continue the discussion on elements of human resources planning by getting into what can be described as attracting applicants. Now, there are several ways of attracting applicants, some which are using the current IT methods, some which are using conventional methods, but above all the process remains the same in its core. What has been added on to the traditional methods of applicant sourcing is that this has been made a task in its own right, and people are being appointed for talent hunt. It may be as consultants, it may be as headhunting agencies, and the sources of dissemination of information need not necessarily be through the printed media, but it can be through the creation of a home page, it can be through using enterprise websites, and it can be in different modes depending upon what is the age bracket of the applicant you are looking at. The general assumption is that people below 40 are spending more time surfing and networking in certain geographies than in others. No generalization of this variety is entirely ever universal, and it is best to work under this notion. But then, while looking at various techniques, it is also necessary to look at some of the more fashionable techniques, if I can use that word, of attracting talent, which begins with predictably using enterprise websites. Enterprises' online recruitment process is an important strategy to attract talent. The presumed advantage is on speed and efficiency. Of course, it helps the registration function and lists available jobs. It also provides information about the role of the employees and the company culture and values. It allows applicants to get a good idea of whether enterprise would suit them or not. But the question is not of whether enterprise suits them or not. The question is equally whether they suit the enterprise or not, and on this there seem to be no filters. One of the useful techniques which have been tried here and which comes out very useful here is internship schemes. The internship schemes can be developed to attract first and second year university students. And as interns, you have a chance of being under observation and getting a gut feel of how the organization works. This gives students an opportunity to work with the enterprise. Students gain valuable experience, and there is the possibility of becoming a full-time employee after graduation. Interns take on same responsibilities as management trainees and learn about sales, marketing, customer service, business management, administration support. But there is a real danger of this being converted into a labor saving device of full-time employees. And in certain sectors, this is becoming so endemic and so common that the standard of service is going down. And it has become a tool either of saving on losses or multiplying on profits, depending upon which argument is holding the center stage at what stage. Especially in the hospitality industry, with the kind of rates which are charged in prestigious halls of prestigiously branded names in the hospitality sector, to have trainees of hospitality institutions being put there to handle important clients who do not know the difference between one drink or another, and the trainees will not know the nuances of which food to serve when, help to buffer in with lower grade skills, skills which are really of a much higher order in terms of requirements. So, these distortions which take place in workplace because of internship schemes has to be kept under check. Enterprise Graduate Management Trainee Program is a useful tool in this direction. We will not spend time detailing this in any manner, but these are well understood norms and approaches. But I will walk you through the training and selection planning steps. By the time you have reached this point of discussion in this presentation, it is assumed that you have some understanding of what is recruitment, selection, skill formation, redeployment about, because we have spent some time discussing that. So, there is no point in visiting it, but we can spend some time in looking at the steps of planning, and I intend to take you through some of them to understand how planning for recruitment and selection process can take place. Step number 1, identify the vacancies and evaluate the needs. Indeed, much in planning begins with identification of a need. Recruitment provide opportunities to departments such as aligning staff skill sets to initiatives and goals, and planning for departmental and individual goals. So, the key words here are aligning staff skill sets to initiatives and planning for departmental and individual goals, as an independent activity. For newly created positions, one has to understand and take into consideration strategic goals of the department. One has to conduct analysis of upcoming changes. So, anticipative change management is an important skill here, and planning to a very large extent is about anticipating changes, mastery of techniques for mapping them, filling them, operating them, and then carrying out mid-term correction if so required, and that is the scope of planning. These may impact the job role, analysis of the core competencies, gaps in skills, core skills required in the future. It touches upon, besides vacancies and evaluation of needs, replacement. Review the role and decide if there are any changes required, as certain tasks and responsibilities performed by the various person may not or should not be performed by the new person. No two people will have identifiable skills, and if they do not have identifiable skills, the job description may be broadly amenable to 20% modification, and then you have got a creative synergy between what is available and what is required. It is for the planning processes to identify this level of tolerance, and identification of a functional level of tolerance would be essential to ask basically how much of the job specifications can be modified to meet the limits of growth of the new incumbent. The changes in classification of positions from represented to non-represented will require possibly union notice and agreement. The tasks carried out by the previous employee needs to be known. Tasks to be removed or added need to be worked out. Supervisory or load representatives, budgetary responsibilities and work hours need to be looked at, which means essentially that you move from replacement, which is a transitional issue, to step 2, that is developing position description all over again, which is basically a modification of the previous job description, but it has to be made current. The upscalability is what could be asked. If once you determine the job classification and map the appropriate payroll title, the identified tasks, workflows and accountabilities, then the enabling department has to plan on how to operate and grow. Now, these tasks of identifying tasks, identifying workflows, identifying accountabilities, 3 operations are critical to organizational growth. The trouble is, in many situations they are slurred over, and worse, in many situations they are not even factored in, because it is assumed that it will take care of itself. It does not take care of itself. Neglected, it tends to get complicated, complex and creates its own jerks and jolts, which are difficult to handle at a more fossilized state. This should be converted to career planning and training by providing clear distinction between levels of responsibilities and competencies required. If used as a benchmark to assist in ensuring internal and external equity, then it can be also a part of the social responsibilities, obligations, which in many parts of the world have been put on the plate of the corporate world. Perhaps they should not have been made, but that is another debate. One has to identify the responsibilities and duties. You have heard this before. This slide will help you to get the breakup of duties and responsibilities. It will be in the domain of general information, position purpose, essential functions, minimum requirements and preferred qualifications. It would be a good idea to convert this on a piece of paper. Step 3, develop recruitment plans. In addition to the position placement goals, the plan should contain advertising channels to be used to achieve these goals. And today the advertising channels are very large, ranging from word of mouth to websites. The recruitment plan is typically developed by the hiring manager in conjunction with the department of HR coordinator. The recruitment plan elements are the following: posting period, placement goals, additional advertising resources, diversity agencies and resume banks. It is important to be cognizant of these elements, because these are the building blocks of recruitment. If these elements are again eliminated or one does not focus on them, there is trouble. The trouble is more latent than manifest, therefore, at times gets ignored only at the risk of causing huge damage to the actual organizational functioning. Step 4 is select and search committee, more easily stated than done. In fact, people believe walking on to select and search committees is a status symbol, when really speaking it is a specialized function. select or search committees have to ensure that applicants selected for the interview and final consideration are evaluated by more than one individual to minimize the potential for personal bias. The hiring manager will identify members who will have direct and indirect interaction with the applicants in the course of their job. It is usually useful to plan for recruitment in a manner in which there are at least 2 to 3 filters, and each filter has an objective, and the summary of the findings of that filter need to be recorded for overall coordination at the final stage. But then this methodology can vary. Each hiring manager should make an effort to appoint a search committee that represents a diverse cross section of the staff, because this has both professional and social overtones. The unrepresented groups and women are now being progressively put on the search committee. For positions that are frequently recruited and utilized, a search committee should be in a flowing mode, so that group thinking or collective bias does not start affecting the decisions. The hiring manager will determine the size and composition of the committee. It is recommended that the committee include at least one individual who has a strong understanding of the role. This usually goes into abeyance. You have the designated superiors there, you have interest groups there, you have a certain balance of the political forces there, but you do not always have a specialist who understands the role. In fact, this is a huge problem in recruitment for the HR area itself. Let me give you an example. You are recruiting for an industrial relations position. Either there is nobody from HR function on the panel who understands industrial relations, or worse still, you have somebody from HR, but not somebody who understands industrial relations, which is a super specialization. I have known of public enterprises, and I am quite sure this is valid of private enterprises too, in fact much more so there, constituting search committees for HR industrial relations function, and they say we must get an HR man on this. So far so good. Then they write to a prestigious institution asking for a nomination as an expert. The expert institution could not care less on who goes. They select the first man willing to go, who probably wants to go because he has a personal reason for visiting that city or that organization, or sheer boredom from his own work, and he is sent off. And in this case, I discovered that for an industrial relations job, the expert was an expert in stress management. Now, anybody who knows HR would realize that an industrial relations job has very little overlap with familiarity of expertise in stress management skills. And mind you, this was at the topmost level. We need to take the business of constitution of selection committees far more seriously than what has been done so far, because the losses which are then passed on to the organization because of a faulty judgment of the skills can be huge. If you think the story ends there, it does not. In constitution of panels, eminence is very often confused, as Professor Devendranath Sharma used to say, with eminence. You may be very eminent professional, but that eminence does not make you omniscient. It does not make you a person with skills which that exact task requires. The purpose of these illustrations is to focus attention on anybody who is willing to hear the need to constitute sensitive selection committees who have the requirements, and the trigger was to say that there should be at least one individual with a strong understanding of the role and the contribution of the department, a job specialist, technical or functional, a staff representative if position has supervisory responsibilities. You do not need a staff representative if it is a research job, but you do need a staff representative if the position has supervisory responsibilities. An individual who will interact closely with the position or serve as the main customer needs also to be on the panel. The long and short of it is that the constitution of a panel for selection is a critical task which needs to be carried on with sufficient degree of sensitivity, and the different steps cannot be taken to be assumed. Step 5, post position and implement recruitment plans. Please read this slide carefully. The purpose of the description here is to focus your attention on a very simple proposition. Standard operating procedures need to be documented to make sure the whole effort is carried out in a scientific manner, and this cannot be taken for granted. If taken for granted, there will be an issue which will surface years to come, by which time efforts at rectification would have grown too late. Step number 6, review applicants and develop a short list. Applicants are those who apply during the initial application period. Candidates who apply after the initial application period are considered as expression of interests, and there are many situations where people who have applied subsequently after the initial period have not been considered because of a technical flaw. Each committee member may provide comments to each applicant's qualifications as they relate to the minimum requirements of the position. This is very rarely observed, and this is either left to the service department or the chairman to satisfy himself. The chair reviews all such committee comments and develops a short list. It is important to go through the second and the third step to have a scientific shortlisting. If the short list is deemed to represent a sufficiently diverse applicant pool, the short list will be approved. Now, this is a very important concept. The short list must represent a sufficiently diverse applicant pool. Once approved, the applicant can then be contacted for interviews. Step 7 is conduct of the interview. The interview is the single most important step in the selection process, and the opportunity of the employer to learn about the employee to be or aspiring employee and vice versa is critical. How do you prepare for the interview? You choose 1 or 2 questions from each competency and minimally required skills to develop the interview questions. You do not just walk into an interview panel and assume you know because you are a designated superior. There should be a structured process for conduct of the interviews, and I put down here some items which which are usually followed in the more evolved companies. The first step you heard me say is to choose 1 or 2 questions from each competency and minimally required skills to develop the interview questions, and presumably the interview committee has a listing of the competencies which are required for acquittal of that job. Review the applicant's application, resume, and make note of any issues that need to be follow up, which means there is a correlation between the analysis of the applicant's profile or resume as available to the selection committee and the listing of the queries or the questions which have arisen out of the job profile or the competency required. Selection committee should determine the following. Please read this. From a perusal of the listings made here, it is clear that the questions have to be identified, the person who is going to ask that question with supplementaries have to be identified, the sequence has to be put in position, and above all, any other detail the applicants may need about the role that were noted in the position description should be shared at the time of the interview. It is important to get an informed applicant. If the applicant needs a detail, give it to him. There are a lot of assumptions internal to an organization which the selection committee assumes to be generously available, which they are actually not. Like the selection committee, like the HR department, the applicant himself may be bounded by his experience and his domain. So, the last recommendation is usually observed by default, and I find it necessary to flag it. Any other detail the applicants may need about the role that were not noted in the position description should be shared, and a technique which I have used with considerable positive impact is giving an opportunity to the candidate at the end of the interview to raise any doubts which he may have by asking him, would you like to ask us any question? That creates tremendous confidence in the ability of the organization to forge relationships. And these relationships are central to enduring work exchanges. Step 8, select hire. Once the interview is over, the committee members will need to assess the extent to which each one met the selection criteria. The search committee rating sheet will be helpful in justifying decisions and making them as objective as possible. Documentation is the key and required to be in compliance with organizational requirements. I cannot adequately emphasize the need for documentation. A common failing, I hope it does not even qualify for a 50% generalization, is that even where documentation is available, the selectors first identify the people, then the marking across the columns is done to suit the conclusions which have already been reached. This quite defeats the purpose of creating breakups of scoring, because the breakups of scoring are supposed to mark across the competencies required, and if one is going to be casual about assessing across the competencies, then the results of the incumbent in position will not be as satisfying as would have been otherwise. When I have raised this in course of the interviews with colleagues, they have said that the columns are too many and too large, therefore too complicated to fill, therefore reverse engineering of sorts will be the only way of meeting the technical requirements and yet not making it over powerfully improbable in operation. My recommendation to that kind of a situation is simplify the columns, cluster the traits required. If a figure has to be named for the sake of convergence, I would say have 5 columns of core traits, but let the traits and the scoring add up. Let it be a meaningful process, and you will find that the results of this kind of selection are extremely conducive to organizational growth. It is important to keep the following in mind. Please read through this. Finalize recruitment. Upon completion of the recruitment process, the offer to the selected finalist is made, the salary is offered to be equitable and leads to retention and motivation of the employees. We now move on to the analysis of skill formation, having gone through concerns of recruitment and selection. Now, it hardly needs emphasis to say that skill is the ability the employee and the managers carry to the tasks to make the company more effective and develop their own careers. We have also talked of leadership, and leadership also helps an organization to move forward, but there are examples of other organizational skills that are just as important that any employee in an organization can develop. In other words, the person recruited, besides the skills on the job, the technical skills, should have certain basic analytical skills, should have certain basic adjustment skills, should have certain basic coordination skills, and should be always able to manage diversity. This is a listing of the data collection tools to identify skill gaps. To move it forward, alternative approaches to identifying skills in the jobs require building upon traditional approaches, studying superior performance and identifying the traits, characteristics and behaviors that differentiate the average from the superior performer. The superior performer and the average performer both go around their work day, but their difference needs to be identified to push the subordinate performer to the level of the superior performer. The second approach is perform interviews and organize focus groups of managers and superior performers. These are techniques which at your stage of learning one hears it, takes it on board and moves on. Skill models by position, function and level of the company always help. One universal set of skills for all employees and positions, but focus is always on merit. One must build a common language, frame of reference for everyone. It makes it easier to compare employees to one another across positions and functions. It eases administration of selection and development practices. It helps align everyone towards a common culture and can support a quick change. To start concluding, therefore, this aspect of the discussion, it is important to recognize that skill models by position are important. Each model for each position will take considerable time, effort and expense if well done. Lack of competency commonality for position to position will make it more difficult to compare, and therefore, competency commonality must be attempted. What should be varied is the level of expertise needed from one point to another. Every time an employee moves from one position to another, they will have to learn new competencies and abandon those that they have been focusing on improving. Skill model for job function are listed here, and I think it is important to realize the same model applies to all positions within a job function. So, what one is being asked to recognize is that there are certain commonality models of traits across the organization. These commonality models are broken up with functional variations from marketing to sales to production to what have you, and then it is further converted into a matrix mode by the scale at which those competencies are to be developed as you go up the ladder. Once you have got that in position, you have got the organizational requirements mapped. Once you have got the organizational requirements mapped, then you have what can be called the availability map. By superimposing the second on the first, the gaps can be realized, recognized, and that is your learning and development requirement. From that learning and development requirement, one will work out the future directions of growth, of facilitation of skill development within the organization, which will be tempered as usual by business pressures and business results. The skill matrix level and proficiencies is therefore the result. The skill matrix defines levels of proficiency or skills in terms of set behavior. I have just explained this to you. The number in the rating systems are replaced by job titles, and this helps employees understand the desired level of skills for each job, and this is an integral part of manpower planning. This is an integral part of HRP, and this is what is at the core of significance of this entire activity, which is at the heart of organizational performance, because ultimately whatever be the structures, whatever be the processes, whatever be the procedures, it is the human being behind the managerial action which will determine its effectiveness and it will determine its operation, and for that a proper backup of the HRP process is a must, failing which it becomes akin to fiddling with wires at the dark. Sometimes success comes, but there are many occasions on which success just has not come, and it is impossible to ensure a certain stability in the results, which alone will be able to acknowledge the future with certain degree of surety and confidence for the organization to grow. For the present, thank you.